Hello, here we are again. I want to talk to you today a bit about rhetoric. This is not a new topic for any of you, really. This is something that we've gone over in different ways at different times to different degrees in the past, but it is something that has become particularly urgent for us to review and focus on a little bit as your exam is coming up. And so my goal is to blend our discussion of rhetoric into our reading of the Canterbury Tales. Because as you have picked up on, I'm sure, much of the Canterbury Tales is rhetoric. And we'll see more of that later. But let's take a wide-angle view of rhetoric now and look at it in a broader understanding. Look at this picture. The wide angle was an intended pun in case you didn't pick up on that. But, I have to explain these jokes, otherwise I'm afraid someone might miss them, and then, I wouldn't get to laugh. But, oh well. Look at the picture. This picture is interesting. Or I wouldn't have put it here, right? But why is it interesting? Look at the questions off to the side. These are meant to poke your brain a little bit. Is this picture meant to mean anything? Obviously, whether or not this picture means anything might depend to some extent on where the picture was displayed. If this picture was taken just on off chance, a guy was standing by the road, there was a storm coming across the prairie, he looked up and saw a car coming as well and thought, hey, cool picture, and took it, no big deal. But once the picture is taken, the picture can have a variety of significances. But then you may also find out that, no, actually, this was an artist's conception. This was an idea that somebody had. They wanted to make a point. Or maybe this was a journalist who was out reporting on a certain story. They were writing about the destruction of the farmland and the resulting dust storms that were moving across the prairie, destroying people's livelihood and leaving people who thought that they were going into land that would result in the fulfillment of the American dream, but instead they ended up buying a Dust Bowl. And so here you have a number of different scenarios, and each one of them could explain this picture and would give a very different significance to the meaning of this picture. Why was it taken? What does it mean? Is that a storm cloud in the background, or is that a dust cloud? Is this a result of destroyed ground? Is this a good argument for terraced farming? Is it a good argument against global warming? All of these become relevant questions as you think about the picture. What is it besides and this would feed into rhetorical situation, but what is it that makes this picture particularly remarkable? I think you could talk about a number of things. You could talk about the lonely automobile, right? In the face of the forces of nature and the length of the road, the distance traveled. You could talk about the flatness of the land, the way the camera is positioned so that so much of the frame is taken up by what is above the land. The dust cloud in the back is meant to be the focus. Man's attempt to impose order upon nature, seen in the flat ground, the ordered posts lining the road, the automobile itself, and yet man is still at the mercy of the forces of nature, despite his attempts. These are all things that can come out of just a cursory examination of what's going on here. And all of it does come back to the question of what might this picture be used as part, or what argument might this picture be used as a part of? How might this picture be used to prove a point or to make a point? And perhaps even a emotionally powerful point. These are all good questions. And these are questions that fit into the bigger issue that we need to discuss. And that is the issue of the rhetorical situation. If we understand the photograph or a sentence, if we are to understand the photograph or a sentence, so if we are to understand the photograph or a sentence, we must consider the situation that created the context for that expression, visual or verbal. So you have here several things being said. If we're to understand the photograph, a photograph or a sentence, a photograph can basically be a visual sentence in a sense. If we're to understand these things correctly, we must see them in the context that created them. What are the elements that surrounded these works of either verbal rhetoric or visual rhetoric? The AP board lists out several objectives that they intend for you to review as you prepare for the exam. And we're going to go through those pretty quickly here, just to give you an overview of them, and then I'll elaborate on each of them in more detail as we go through this presentation. First, so 1A, so this is the first section, the first major objective in reading. They want you to be able to identify and describe the components of the rhetorical situation. And the components that they identify are the exigence, the audience, the writer, the purpose, the context, and the message. So if you notice those words, I think all of those would be familiar. The exigence is one that may not be as familiar to you, but essentially the exigence is the what is it that prompts the reader, right? Or the author, sorry. What is it that prompts the author? It's a question of motivation, but it's different from purpose, because purpose is what the author wants to accomplish, right? Exigence is the circumstances that move the author or the photographer or whoever else to produce the piece of rhetoric that they produce. And then you go down to these subpoints, and there's a lot of them. But the RHS is rhetorical situation, and then it goes rhetorical situation is a text collectively refers to the exigence, purpose, audience, and context of the message. We've already said that, so there you go. And a lot of these actually get repetitive, and this is how the AP board writes their stuff. The exigence is the part of a rhetorical situation that inspires, stimulates, provokes, or prompts the writer to create a text. I just said that, but there you go. That's it in writing in their own words. The purpose of a text is what the writer hopes to accomplish with it. So the writer may have more than one purpose for a text. And so that's good to remember. The writer may have more than one purpose. And it's important, I think, as you look at a text to ask yourself, well, what purposes might there be? And is there a hierarchy to those purposes? Is there a primary purpose, a secondary purpose? Now, a lot of writing that was done was essentially done because the author had to eat, right? the author had to, had to produce work in order to have an income. But that will always be one purpose. But certainly there will be other purposes, and there will be an exigence, which is completely different. The exigence is what motivates them to write about that particular topic. In the case of one of Dickens' famous works, Tale of Two Cities, I think his best work, the one of the purposes undoubtedly is that Dickens was a writer who was living for a long time hand to mouth, and he had to produce work in order to put food on the table. But he had a deeper understanding of the rhetorical concern, of the political concerns of his time. And his work, A Tale of Two Cities, is written as a warning to keep England from becoming like the France of the French Revolution. That was a concern that he had. And as you read through the work, you will see Dickens' deep suspicion of any kind of mob action. You will see Dickens' political viewpoints and his passionate cry for sanity and for even a sense of self-sacrifice and civic duty to prevent the kind of horror that engulfed France from ever becoming a reality in England. And so you have these different purposes. Also, you have an audience, right? An audience of a text has shared as well as individual beliefs, values, needs, and backgrounds. And so this is an important part of the rhetorical situation. You need to be able to analyze what the shared beliefs, values, needs, and background of the audience is. This becomes important as you think about how the author is speaking, who they're speaking to. If you want to evaluate the effectiveness of what they're saying, you need to ask yourself, how well are they connecting with the audience? How well do they understand the audience? Are they aware of the audience's background, the audience's beliefs, of the audience's values, the audience's needs? This is a crucial part of any effective rhetorical analysis. Writers, this is now point E, writers create text within a particular context. That context includes a time, a place, and an occasion. This is also important to understand. What is the time? What's the place? What's the occasion? Why are they doing what they're doing when they're doing it? This is, again, a little more general and may or may not be helpful. Sometimes it is irrelevant whether or not a speech was made in winter or summer, but sometimes it is very relevant. Sometimes it's very, very critical to what is being said. So the time, the place, and the occasion are important parts of the rhetorical situation. And then I, notice it skips some. We'll come to those later on. But right now, we go to I for rhetorical situation. The importance of an argument introduces the subject and or writer of the argument. Sorry, I read that completely wrong. The introduction of an argument introduces the subject and or writer of the argument to the audience. An introduction may present the argument's thesis. An introduction may orient, engage, and or focus the audience by presenting quotations, intriguing statements, anecdotes, questions, statistics, data, contextualized information, or a scenario. So this is a handy little list here of possible ways to introduce a topic, and a way to introduce a topic that will grab the audience's attention. Analyzing the author's introduction is often key to understanding the author's argument. This is part of the rhetorical situation. Again, being able to analyze this carefully will tell you how in tune the audience is with, so the author is, the speaker is with their audience. Then RHS 1J, the conclusion of an argument brings the argument to a unified end. A conclusion may present the argument's thesis. It may engage and/or focus the audience by explaining the significance of the argument within a broader context, making connections, calling the audience to act, suggesting a change in behavior or attitude, proposing a solution, leaving the audience with a compelling image, explaining implications, summarizing the argument, or connecting to the introduction. All of these are great ways to conclude. But paying attention to how the author concludes will make you a better reader and a better writer. So these are significant and important elements to pay attention to analyze. Then we move on to point B of section 1, which is still talking about rhetorical situation and about reading. And so what you have, your main point here, it says explain how an argument demonstrates an understanding of an audience's beliefs, values, or needs. So here you as the writer and the analyzer, right, need to be able to explain how this writer that you're analyzing, the person you're analyzing, how they demonstrate an understanding of their audience. And so point F here, writers' perceptions of an audience's values, beliefs, needs, and background guide the choices they make. Point G, to achieve a purpose, writers make choices in an attempt to relate to an intended audience's emotions and values. Point H, arguments seek to persuade or motivate action through appeals. The modes of persuasion, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But basically, arguments seek to persuade or motivate action through appeals. So, different ways of presenting persuasive material. And then K, writers may make comparisons. They may use similes, metaphors, analogies, or anecdotes in an attempt to relate to an audience. Effective comparisons must be shared and understood by the audience to advance the writer's purpose. These are important things to look for. A writer who fails to do this well will fail to communicate effectively. And then point L, writers' choices regarding syntax and diction influence how the writer is perceived by an audience and may influence the degree to which an audience accepts an argument. Point M, word choice may reflect writers' biases and may affect their credibility with a particular audience. And then N, because audiences are unique and dynamic, writers must consider the perspectives, contexts, and needs of the intended audience when making choices of evidence, organization, and language in an argument. So that last point, again, is basically saying that audiences are different. Not all audiences are the same. And that writers have to consider the perspectives and contexts and needs of the audience, and they must use that to inform their choices of organization, language, or argument. Well, this is all fine and good, but frankly, that list of requirements, while it contains a lot of information, it can be a bit overwhelming. I would encourage you to review them, to think back through them, to look over them, but let's look at this PowerPoint, I think it can be helpful as well. So PowerPoint picture. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, we'll see. But here you do have a pretty clear diagram that highlights a lot of these ideas. And I'm just trying to pull up a marker here. But look at, you have the three main circles, right? The three main circles, the writer, the subject, and the audience. And those are all included in this light green that's behind here, right? And that light green represents the rhetorical situation. These are all part of the rhetorical situation, and they all relate to each other to some extent. So the writer knows something about the subject and the audience knows something about the subject and the writer, right? The subject is in some way relevant to both the writer and the audience, hopefully. Either, and it's related to them, whether it's relevant or not. The relationship may be one of irrelevance, and then there's suddenly a whole lot more of a burden on the writer or the speaker, in that case, to convince the audience to listen. And so then this attempts to show that there's a text that unifies all three of these, right? There's a text that unifies these, and then there's other elements that overlap. So this idea of exigence, right, which is why the writer is writing about this subject, that typically relates specifically to the relationship between the writer and the subject. Purpose has to do with what the writer hopes, how the writer hopes the audience will respond to the subject. So the purpose, the writer is seeking this from the audience, right? And then genre is how the subject is presented to the audience. Is it presented in the form of a story? Is it presented in the form of a cause and effect, sort of logical presentation? If you do this, this will happen, kind of thing. These are all important elements of this material. When we talk about the rhetorical situation, this is what we're talking about, and this is all critical to the issue. You go back and you ask yourself the questions. What's the text, right? What's the subject? What's the audience? What's the writer? Why is he writing? What is the occasion for the writing? What's the purpose? What's the genre? All of those elements factor into the rhetorical situation.